Hello, welcome everyone. Delighted that you could join us this evening for the talk and discussion, Race, Memory, Data. Just wanted to begin by recognizing that we're on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Really important to remember this working out of a post-secondary institution in arts and cultural organizations and the important role we have to play in terms of changing the stories that have been told and to continue the work of decolonization and reconciliation. My name is Adam Johal. I'm director of SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. We're proud to be partnering on this talk with Emily Carr, University of Art and Design, SFU's City Program, Arsenal Pulp Press, and Massy Books to present this. We've been programming out of the School for Contemporary Art since it moved down from Burnaby Mountain since 2010. We've done about 800 or so public events, and they're predominantly free of charge, and we try and maintain the publicness of what a public university is around ideas of social and environmental justice, arts, culture, and community, and urban issues. And so you can go onto our website to see all the upcoming events. Besides the ones that were scrolling earlier, we'll have information out next week. Salem, the chairperson of the Squamish Nation, will be giving a talk on implementing UN DRIP, the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, and look forward to a number of great conversations that will come from that. It's wonderful to be having friends come up here like Henry Tsang, Andy Yan, and wonderful to welcome Jack Tchen here. And just in terms of being in this building where we are proud members of the Downtown East Side and Chinatown neighborhoods, really important we reflect that programming in the work that we do. It's my honor to be introducing Dr. Melissa Karmen Lee. She's a visual arts and literature scholar, curator, archivist, and storyteller with research interests in public art and social engagement. She currently holds the appointment of Chief Executive Officer at the Chinese Canadian Museum, which is just located a few blocks away on Pender Street. And I went for the first time just on Friday. It's an absolutely stunning building. It's been done with such forethought. I know there's members of the provincial government here. It's really a gift to the city in terms of how to think about our history in a critical way. If you haven't gone, I highly, highly encourage you to go. So please join me in welcoming Melissa Karmen Lee.
Thank you so much, Am, and so great for you to come by, and looking forward to working more in partnership together. Yes, the museum, Chinese Canadian Museum, we only opened 2 months ago, and so we really welcome all of you to come, and so great to see some members of the provincial government in the audience, which we're really thankful for our opening. But enough about me and my museum. Why we're here today is to listen to this amazing panel on race, memory, and data. We have 3 wonderful scholars who often also act as curators, artists, and food writers that all kind of think through history through the contemporary, and that kind of transition between both is really interesting part of their research and work. So all 3 panelists will be speaking first for 10 minutes and introducing a little bit more about their work, and then we will sit down and have a very robust discussion, I think, and afterwards we will welcome questions from the audience. So as each speaker comes up, I will introduce them. Our first speaker is Henry Tsang. He is an artist and curator. His recent book, which is why we're all here together today, is called White Riot, the 1907 Anti-Asian Riots in Vancouver, published by Arsenal Pulp Press this year. And the book explores the conditions and leading up to and the impact of a demonstration and parade in Vancouver organized by the Asiatic Exclusion League that ensued a mob attack on the city's Chinese Canadian and Japanese Canadian communities. Past recipient of the Viva Award and also an associate dean at Emily Carr, University of Art and Design. Please join me in welcoming Henry.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Thanks, Joe Hall, for hosting this event. Julia Aoki and the incredible team here at SFU Vancity Office of Community Engagement. My name is Henry Tsang, as Melissa mentioned. I'm going to quickly take you through to, so this is the title, in case you didn't know. And I'm going to be talking about place in relationship to race, memory, and data. But first I want to talk about, I guess related to place, the experience that I had as a little kid, flying from Hong Kong, where I was born at the age of 3 3/4, to, first Tokyo, because we stopped off in Tokyo, and that's the first time my sister and I ever heard another language than Cantonese being spoken or understood that it was different. And it was at first funny for us to hear other people speak something else, and we didn't know what was going on. And then landing in Vancouver, and the visceral effect of being in a place where you no longer felt you were normal anymore. And until then, until we started getting slightly older, we realized we were being identified as Chinese, as opposed to just, again, not knowing that we were moving from one British colonial space in Hong Kong to another, which is British Columbia. So growing up in Vancouver, I've been very aware of that earlier experience and being different, because Vancouver was a white nationalist town back then. It was white dominant. There were other ethnicities, cultures around, but really minority of the people living here. And I thought it was really confusing. The confusion turned into an articulation of questioning about my relationship to this particular place. And when I first came across the fact that there was this 1907 Anti-Asian Riot organized by the Asiatic Exclusion League, I was kind of amazed that I'd never heard of it until my late 20s. It was never introduced in the school system. And, subsequently after that, I tried to find out a bit more. I also tried to find a bit more about what it might have been like as a Chinese person if we had moved here earlier, prior to 1968. But actually it would have been really hard, because Canada didn't change the Immigration Act until 1967 to a point system, thereby allowing people to be assessed equally no matter where you're from, because there's such a priority on Britain and also Western Europe and places where people are considered more white than others. And of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act didn't allowed 44 people over 24 years to come into Canada. And then prior to that, there was the head tax. And prior to that, way prior to that, there wasn't as many restrictions. But it was an interesting kind of path of discovery. These are some images from the first, not from the riots. This is what is now known as Larwell Park, Beatty Street Grounds, where the parade began for the anti-Asian demonstration that ended up at City Hall. And from there, the hysterical and inflammatory speeches being relayed from City Hall out to the crowds whipped up enough of a frenzy that a mob broke out and attacked Chinatown, and then spilled over for the following day into the Powell Street area, where the rioters attacked the Japanese Canadian community. So here's a colorized photograph from my project 360 Riot Walk. But before I talk about 360 Riot Walk and the kinds of alternative histories, I suppose stories that weren't told commonly, especially reported in the English language media, there was this other project that I worked on. But these questions of not just what happened here that might have affected me and my family if we had been here earlier, and definitely affected those who were here. I also was wondering how this could be interpreted as an art project. As an artist, I have a research-based practice. There are certain situations, conditions, political or social or cultural, that I find fascinating enough to try to explore and then find a way to kind of express it through an artistic lens. And something like this, the white nationalist history of this very place, and connected to other white nationalist histories in Northern America and South America. The first iteration of this particular topic of the 1907 Anti-Asian Riots was a food project that was called Riot Food Here, imagining, it took the form of a pop-up food offering at 4 of those locations along the parade, demonstration, and the riots from 1907, basically asking, what would you have eaten as an angry white man just before you went out to attack the Chinese or the Japanese in their homes? What would you have eaten as a Chinese or Japanese person before the angry white man came over to attack you? What would you have eaten as a South Asian who got beat up in, oops, I'm going the wrong way, got beat up in Bellingham 3 days prior to the riot, forced marched to the border, only allowed in because you're a British subject, ended up in Vancouver just in time to watch this other riot that wasn't aimed at you, but by extension you would be eventually included and lumped into. And what would you have eaten as you watched the angry white men attack the Asians on your land? So food from 5 different cultural perspectives. There's indigenous, there was Chinese, Japanese, white, specifically English, with the roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, and also Punjabi. And that was actually restaged last week at the Massy Art Center. Massy Books is outside with books of White Riot. Please buy a copy. Little plug. And here's a photograph of myself at what looks like a makeshift table from the detritus after a riot. It was carefully crafted. And there's Chris Barnholden, a local chef, who interpreted the research that I had done, trying to figure out what people might have been eating around 1907, and he gave it a contemporary twist. There's Chris and myself outside what used to be Old Market Hall, right next to the Carnegie Center downtown, and there's an overhead shot. Really exciting conversations happened out of that one. And the third stop was in Chinatown, outside of the Classical Garden, Sun Yat-sen Chinese Classical Garden. Quite a crowd that we drew over there. And this is the last stop at Oppenheimer Park. And that's where the riots more or less ended nearby. And ironically, the mayor of Vancouver, Alexander Bethune, who was one of the original signing members of the Asiatic Exclusion League, had to come out and appease the angry Japanese men who gathered to discuss their demands for apology and reparations. So that project led to 360 Riot Walk, because the project began with a walking tour of the riots that was led by Michael Barnholden, who is a local poet, and whose walking tours about the 1907 riots had been happening for quite some time. And it was during this walk that I first thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if we I created a 360 Riot Walk so we don't have to wait for Michael to do one every once in a while. And as an embodied experience of the neighborhood, but also with archival photographs integrated and embedded within the 360 images that would respond to your movement as you looked around the neighborhood. And so here's some guided tours that happened with people with these tablets. You can look it up on your phone, 360riotwalk.ca. It's available, it's free on any browser. But the Powell Street Festival has taken on stewardship of these tours, and has led them for the last few summers. It launched at actually the very first tour, guided tour, was at the Pulp Festival in 2019. I love this picture because there's people looking like they're staring at a brick wall. And this project turned into a book because I was kind of worried that something on the internet wouldn't last too long, That's sort of what eventually happens. I had so many problems with Apple operating systems. They keep on changing things, and all of a sudden things don't work anymore. So yeah, with that experience as well, I thought, well, okay, it'd be great to have the script available, because this project online isn't going to last forever. And here's the script. And it's just in the English only, because there's actually 4 different languages that you can experience for the walking tour. The others being Cantonese, Japanese, and Punjabi. So yeah, this book was this opportunity to expand on, contextualize, and place within a contemporary context some of the issues that were explored in the book, in the project, 360 Riot Walk, with the addition of 7 contributing writers, of whom one of whom is Andy here tonight. There's 13 stops on the tour, and I've got my slides all out of order. Here's Michael Barnholden in red, leading the Riot Food Here walking tour that launched all the food pop-up experiences in the following weekends. And I'm going to probably have to cut this short soon. I've got short videos of like a little kind of simulation of how you might experience your tablet as you look around the neighborhood. Oh my goodness. And you can zoom in and out of the imagery. Yeah, so these archival images are embedded into the landscape. Some of these documents are put up almost like posters, because that was the kind of social, political, and in this case, like physical environment that people had to navigate and negotiate through and survive if you were being targeted as undesirable or a threat, right? And one of the challenges we faced trying to figure out where to, what the route of the tour would be, was to, well, first of all, we decided not to start off at the very beginning of the tour, because downtown to Main and Hastings, and then to Chinatown, and then to Powell Street was just too far. So we started actually in Gastown. And then from there we went to Old Market Hall, City Hall. But after City Hall, the mob went down Market Alley. And Market Alley is right behind, sort of next to the Carnegie. There's this alley that kind of ends. There's a T-shaped alley back there, but it looks like this, right? And so Michael Barnholden and I, we co-wrote the script together. We discussed for weeks, whether or not we should include Market Alley as part of the tour, because it's a bit of a challenging space. It's challenging because has anyone been down Market Alley recently? Yeah, you have? Yeah. Well, you know what it's like, right? You're kind of encroaching on other people's space, because there are people hanging out, but there's also people shooting up. And it's not the same vibrant business community that it was in 1907, when you had restaurants and laundries and opium factories. It was like a really important part of Vancouver, although very Chinese. But it's challenging. Plus, you have to be careful not to step on syringes and stuff like that. So we decided to avoid that and go down Pender. And I still feel to this very day that it's not really a missed opportunity, but it's inaccurate, right? So that still bothers me about that. But it was an important decision to make. I still stand behind it, but based on contemporary conditions of the humanitarian crisis that is happening right outside on the streets in this area. Another location that we found kind of also shocking in a different way, almost in the opposite way, is Shanghai Alley. And this is the power of design to destroy any resemblance of a former community. It is so sterile. There's, like, if you walk down there, you feel alienated because it's so bare, and there's no life there. And this was the center of Chinatown. This was bustling. It would have been full of energy, full of sounds, full of smells, full of everything, but not anymore. Has anybody been down there recently? Really? Why? Because you don't live in the seniors' home, right? I mean, that's the only reason people go in and out of there, besides finding a place to take a nap or, again, maybe shoot up nearby. But it's really sad. Oh, I got a simulation of that space. Oops. Okay, I'm going to skip these. Too bad. I should have run these while I was talking. You can find all this stuff online, the simulations online, 360 Riot Walk. And then the fourth, I'm bad at counting, is Oppenheimer Park, formerly known as the Beatty Street Grounds. And this is a really important historic site. When Indigenous people were kicked out of their, dislocated from their homes in Stanley Park, they went here and camped out there for a while. This is a place where it was the home of the Asahi baseball team for the Japanese Canadian community. And this is also known as Kamkamale, which is big leaf maple trees. And this was a seasonal campsite, so that's why the Indigenous folks were very familiar with this particular place. And interestingly enough, this is the place where the city of Vancouver designated for protests for the city as a way to contain protests and also keep protests away from other more respectable parts of the city. So, and a lot of labor protests have happened here and so forth. So, you know, as many people now are aware of, Oppenheimer Park has been a place of other encampments, temporary encampments, tent cities, and indicative of the homelessness issue that we've been facing as a city, not just in the last while, but it goes back to the founding of the city and before, because the history of squatters also is part of the fabric of this place. And it's really interesting also looking at Oppenheimer Park, and you notice there was photographs of the tent cities, images of the tent city in the picture, because the photographs were taken in 2019. And then also William Lyon Mackenzie King, he was a junior minister who was brought in to conduct the Royal Commission, looking at the riots and dealing with the negotiations for compensation for all the damages for the Japanese and the Chinese. And it was in some of the receipts that he received that he first came across the opium factories, and he took that information back to Ottawa and proposed, and for the first time ever, a junior minister got a bill passed in Parliament that became Canada's first ever anti-drug law, the Opium Act. So, you know, what happened in 1907 had all these other ramifications, not just in terms of drugs, homelessness, and other things, but also for the anti-immigration movement, which was actually very successful after this, because Japanese immigration was curtailed significantly. The Continuous Journey Act against South Asians from India was passed shortly after that. The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1923 was passed, again, well, a little bit later, et cetera. So all this information somehow is hopefully embedded in this art project, visually, but also orally, and is made available in the book. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Henry. Next, we have Andy Yan, who is the director of the City Program and associate professor at SFU. He, of course, is well known on many levels in urban planning and urban studies, and has worked all over North America, and holds a master's of urban planning from UCLA, and also is a graduate of SFU. Please welcome Andy.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and I am afraid of touching Max. Max generally dislike me, and I dislike Max, but but thank you so much, and that really here that I'm here to really talk about perhaps my chapter in the book that Henry invited me to write about. Really, if you will, the role of what the numbers would look like, and I think that that's really a role through which I'm known to do in the city, and really part of that kind of conversation, and that in that discussion of data and race and memory, it's actually one through which, on the surface, seems to be fairly straightforward, and that very much when we look at, say, the sizes of the communities in the city of Vancouver at the time, unfortunately, 1907, for the 1907 race riots, just lies between censuses from the 1901 to 1911, that I looked really predominantly at the 1911 census to kind of really give a sense of what kind of community existed at that time, as really, I think that this really talks to really a community through which I think represents a way of knowing a community is through census information. And from that perspective, it's actually fairly straightforward. You find that 3.7% of the population of the city of Vancouver was Chinese, that 2.1% was Japanese, and 0.4% was Hindu. And I think that this begins this, I think, discussion about really how censuses aren't only technical reports or technical documents, but they're also social ones, and that as such, it's ones that really begin to tell you how notions of community, of nationhood, of ethnicity, of race, I think, really occur. And in one way, this kind of presentation, I think, kind of ends here. We're done. That's it. But I think that that when Henry invited me to write this entry, it was, I think, 1,500 words you wanted, and then I gave you something like 3,500 words in terms of that. And as such, it really, I think, begins to take on the opportunity. And what is that opportunity when we kind of just not only look at these numbers, look at census numbers, but we actually really then offer really a time machine. And that in this kind of lack of a time machine, as not all of us have a modified 1981 DeLorean DMC-12, that really it's an opportunity to then go 88 miles or 42 kilometers an hour to actually begin to look at what actually are the values and the ideas behind the census, and how much that tells you about the Canada that was, and also the Canada that is, but perhaps more importantly, the Canada that could be. And as such, that we don't have necessarily this type of time machine, but we very much have these. And that as such, we can look through historic, I think, data sets in terms of giving us an understanding of time and how values change, and yet also, I think, give us a grounding towards where our community is changing and how it's changing, because you move from even this perspective, you see actually the development of new ways of understanding our past, that there's a new infrastructure in towards understanding the digitization of data, and as a means to help a understanding of where our country has gone. And as such, this is moving from just an old set of census documents. There's been a digitization movement which was critical towards that type of understanding of change. And I think that it's understanding that change, it's critical towards understanding how ideas change around things as simple as space. That you take the idea of Vancouver and Vancouver in 2023, and that this is very much the Vancouver in 2023, and that one thinks about this as the boundaries of the city of Vancouver. But yet when we go back to what was Vancouver in 1911, it actually moves from this understanding of Vancouver into this. That this actually is the Vancouver we're talking about. That when we talk about the city of Vancouver, these are actually the boundaries of that city we are talking about. And that those other parts of the city are actually counted as other communities and other boundaries. That we see how the city of Vancouver moves from one city that we know today, but was actually well, back in 1911, 5 distinct separate entities, and begin to understand that space changes, understandings of place changes. And I think from understanding how place changes, we also then to understand the data about the data, and very much how instructions about how data is collected and how that shapes how those numbers are reported. That you find out that very much it is patrilineal, that ideas of gender come into play, that your race or tribal origins is usually, at least according to this instruction to the enumerators, traced through the father. But yet at the same time, it changes for those who are indigenous, and how those numbers are also then collected in towards the ideas of matrilineal identities, and yet also about race in how you see mixed ethnicity, that it didn't exist, that you had to be another, that you could not be biracial, you could not identify yourself as one of being multiple cultures, but yet you had to pick one, and as such, based upon gender. And I think that you move forward in towards how, at this base level of the data behind the data, that it gets to be what's reported, and how what gets reported are 23 separate identities and ideas of culture and ethnicity and race, that it is a mix of nationality, of ethnicity, religion, and geography. That we see the complexities of how ideas of race and ethnicity change over time, and that this is how one idea of those factors are reported out in 1911. And I think it's also not only about what gets reported, but how data is collected. And it's very much how that data is collected. These are the original enumeration records that are now available on the internet, through which you can go and find individual records. And yet, I think from those individual records, you then bring in some interesting questions towards things that aren't reported in the official reports. One in particular that I'm curious about really goes into really how the role and the changing ideas of Chinese Canadians, that we see Chinese Canadians beginning to emerge, that the idea that you could be both Chinese and Canadian starts beginning to emerge in this records. And then also, I think the role of other social economic factors, things like religion, the role of how identifying yourself as Canadian also is related towards factors like religion, and how that plays in towards one's identity. But then one also begins to understand that enumerators were paid 5 cents per sheet, and that really that sheet not only comes through certain, I think, diligences, that some collectors were diligent as they went record by record, and some perhaps were a little more loose in towards how they collected census records. That then it begins to ask whether you look at how much census records start reflecting the respondents, the census, the government of Canada, or that of Henry Thompson, who in this case was the enumerator who was responsible for this particular sheet, and how you, I think, factor that in towards understanding data about a community. But I think within that element, it's also understanding how much that there is this question of the local and global politics behind census data collection, that with the 1911 census, there is actually this resistance within the Chinese Canadian community, that there is actually this census strike, if you will, where this Chinese community back in 1911 in Chinatown had refused to respond to their census enumerators, that they had similarly, I think, had just outright said, we're not going to respond to you, and that really how the census enumerators and the officials back then had also responded to actually then reach out to really the role of the of the Consular General. But then I think it goes back towards a sense of fear, a sense of concern that how this is the emergence of data as surveillance, as the concerns around why the Chinese population back in 1911 didn't want to respond to the census was upon the suspicions around the Mackenzie Commission, which occurred after the riots, that they would be this roundup and mass deportation of the Chinese population back then. But I think that what you'll also see towards the global politics is then the appeal to the Consular General of China. And I think that this actually has a deep relationship towards the politics of today. You start seeing the transnational elements of communities, of the kind of marginalization of the Chinese community in 1911, through which seeked a representative, and while being barred from voting, being barred from being elected office, that instead you see the roles of the Consul General of China being the middle person, the facilitator in these conflicts within the community, and one through which actually occurs on several instances throughout the 20th century, through which we can talk about later. And then, of course, and I think that this is something that comes in today, that if you begin to understand the transnational politics of today, why a figure like the Consular General of China in Vancouver has a role in contemporary politics, that these are the roots of that role. And then, of course, the other side are irate housewives who refuse to answer their census in South Vancouver. And how much that comes into, I think, the idea of the census as a social document, that there are, I think, these elements through which these documents have this idea of participation and non-participation. And then really it's from these ideas of censuses as social documents, you go in and have an opportunity to rethink British Columbia, and in a way, not only rethinking British Columbia, but expanding British Columbian history. And from that perspective, it's an understanding that when we talk about the Chinese Canadian population in 1911, that yes, indeed, 18% of the population the Chinese Canadian population was concentrated in Vancouver, and another 18% in Victoria, but yet at the same time, over 50% of the population was throughout the entire province. And how do we expand that idea of memory as a provincial memory that I think lies into, I think, a challenge, an opportunity to celebrate that province, that idea of a multicultural, multi-ethnic province wasn't something that occurred recently, but has been around British Columbia for a very long time. And we can also similarly see this in terms of communities in British Columbia that were over 10% Chinese. We actually find that in places like Newcastle, which is small around Nanaimo, that it was actually 15% Chinese, and that a place like Victoria was similarly 11% Chinese, and really how that changes in terms of what communities, how the dynamics of those communities were, and also the province that has yet to come from this data set. And then really, I think it's going in towards understanding how censuses have changed over time and their role in both oppression and empowerment, that there is, I think, this idea of racial formation in terms of how categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed in this book by Michael Omi and Howard Manette. But yet, at the same time, it's also how these systems can be used to empower communities, that can be used to really ensure that there is an accountability towards acts of historic and systemic racism. And I think that it's really then going back to the idea of not only the measures of the past, but then what does it mean today as we talk about the city of Vancouver using the 2021 boundaries of the city of Vancouver. And we find that it is very much a population that's 25% Chinese, that's 2% Japanese, and yet also about 5% South Asian, and really how that comes in towards how that community has changed, and that from an original kind of 23 categories of origins that one identified themselves in 1911, it moves to 250 by 2021, and how that talks about an expanded memory and an expanded Canada. And I think that it's also from that perspective, not only taking, I think, the ideas of 1911, but then what happens when we see rhetoric, well, come in fairly recently, that one from something from 30 years ago, that when you come in and talk about how Vancouver becomes Asia Town, that this declaration in 1996 from Vancouver magazine comes into these types of, I think, media representations, and yet also how things change, and how in 2021, Vancouver is the most Asian city in Canada and the United States. In North America, that you'll find that 40% of Metro Vancouverites have roots in Asia, and yet the questions are, what are those kinds of roots, and what are those kinds of stories compared to other communities throughout Canada and the United States? I think the kind of thing that you can also use this chart to do is actually understand where the great Asian restaurants are in North America. But then I think that from that element of the communities that we are and have yet to be, I think that there's a very serious element of how censuses and data can be used to deal with systemic racism and the legacies of the past. As I think that this initiative by the British Columbian government in terms of addressing systemic racism is, I think, part of how we move from how we used to think of ourselves and how we used to measure race into, from really an instrument of control and oppression in towards a tool of empowerment and information. And that as this tool of empowerment and information, we ensure that Vancouver and Hope don't become two separate destinations, and that it's really a future through which roads, we're not going to need any roads. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy, and special round of applause for his first appearance since being the newly tenured Andy and professor at SFU. Well deserved. And our next speaker is Professor Jack Tchen. He is the Clement A. Bryce Professor of Public History and Humanities and Director of the Price Institute on Ethnicity, Cultures, and the Modern Experience at Rutgers University, Newark. He has had 10 years of research on anti-Asian xenophobia, 2-hour documentary on the Chinese Exclusion Act by PBS, exhibition at the New York Historical Society, which led him to focus on the intersectionality history of American eugenics. He has been currently working with the Munsee Lenape elders and honoring enslaved in the region by documenting, sharing, and decolonizing the history of Newark and the larger bioregion. Founding director of the APA Studies Program and Institute at NYU. In 1980, co-founded the New York Chinatown History Project, which is now the Museum of Chinese in America with Charles Lai.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. Thank you so much, Am, for this incredible space and the commitment that your program has to engagement in a serious way. I wish I was nearby to attend the Leanne Simpson event that's coming up. Thank you, Andy. Andy is a longtime friend. Andy and I go back a long ways, but mainly what we do is we go to restaurants and we talk at restaurants. So food figures into our relationship as well. My new friend Henry, thank you so much for this incredible work you've done. It was a privilege to write a little blurb on the back of the book, and that gained me the opportunity to actually come here and speak to you, so I really appreciate that. Thank you, Melissa. Congratulations on this incredible space. And also, I just wanted to say hello to really a new friend, a relatively new friend, who's an amazing artist, installation artist, Kim Hyung, who's also here in the audience. So it's really a pleasure to have her here as well. I thought it might be good to kind of back up and talk a little bit about some of what Raymond Williams talked about, the structures of feelings that are in play here, and that of course are not strictly about Chinese or Asians or anti-Asianism, but have to do with larger dynamics, really of loss and how modernity works. Western modernity, colonial modernity, we can call it many things. So I just wanted to kind of throw out a few kind of key concepts that might be helpful in our kind of unpacking what's happened and what is happening now. And I think the key thing is that as a historian, I'm not so much interested in reconstructing what happened. It's not like there's some simple linear progression. But in fact, what is happening now and how we're understanding that history, either in a critical way or as an accepting kind of inevitability, is really the key to what we do now, how we act, because I believe we're in a very dangerous moment. I spent a lot of my years really looking at the phenomenon of how Chinatown emerges, the phenomenon of yellow peril as it switches from one group to another in North America and Europe and in the colonial context. And it's clear that there are cycles. And it's clear that there are patterns that come back. And I think we're at a particularly dangerous moment now, not only because of the internal divisions within, United States. I live in New York, I live in Brooklyn, and on a daily basis we're now rehearsing what's going to happen in the upcoming presidential elections, but the stakes are particularly high now because climate change and global warming, which fewer and fewer of us are able to deny and to kind of ignore. The stakes are very high because of the way Biden has committed to that. But at the same time, Biden has also, and I voted for Biden, he's also, unfortunately, I think, continued some of the policies that were enacted by the president who will not be named, who existed before him. And we're heading, I believe, as a historian, looking at the patterns, into another Cold War. And it's very clear to see that. And the object of that Cold War is not so much Russia, but it's actually China. And it seems ludicrous to be heading into a Cold War in which you have the United States, which is claiming to be the greenest country and investing the most in the green economy globally, and China, which is also investing heavily, even more so than the United States, into a green world. And it's not to say that either country is right or wrong. Both countries have their deep flaws, but it seems ludicrous to be having a Cold War waged against who's going to be more green, when in fact that Cold War itself is going to prove to be the downfall of the possibility of actually, arriving at something that would be close to reducing the carbons that we're using in our economy. So I kind of want to go back and forth here, and really here the point is that historians, we tend to think of historians as kind of starting with the past and then going to the present, and that there's a linear kind of progression of somehow how that happens. But I think enough of us are aware that history and the historical imagination is not a linear process, but in fact, it's closer to the way Mikhail Bakhtin talked about chronotopes. Chronotopes, for example, the novel is a chronotope, the creation of a novel, and going backwards in time and forwards in time is part of that kind of linking the different patterns that may exist that may only be in the imagination of the novelist, or in the case of Henry's talking about the census, how does the census and the changes of the census actually represent a chronotope of how time changes and categories change. And with Henry's juxtaposition in the 360 view, the panorama, you also see that juxtaposition of how the present tense cities in the park are juxtaposed against the anti-Chinese, right? So our lives and the way our imaginations and the way we understand things are constantly in chronotopic relationship. It's not about some simple relationship with the past determining the present and the present determining the future. So I thought it'd be good to maybe talk about that, both as the liberating potential of the historical imagination, but the potential of giving in too much to the structure of feelings that make it difficult for us to actually take the step and actually begin to understand history and work through the difficulties and actually come at a different place that has a liberating potential that hopefully a historical understanding and historical imagination can have. So I've, spent a lot of years doing different kinds of projects and forming different organizations. I should just say that I certainly agree with the kind of feminist maxim that the personal is political. I would just, as a historian, as a public historian, I would say, of course, the personal is also historical, and that that so much of the historical is not, as a public practitioner, it's not so much acknowledging what the official historians say, it's actually understanding the powerful role of memory and the powerful role of what meanings we make from the memory. And it's not strictly the domain of an academic. It should be something that is part of a general public and popular practice. So I'll just say that the title, Loss, Modernity, and Horror, is really kind of a working through further along of some of the work I've done in the past. I won't necessarily go into that, but I've spent many years working on issues of Chinese exclusion, history of Chinese laundry workers, the experiences of people who've been erased and communities that have been erased, or communities that have been represented as always this other, the inscrutable, mysterious other, or the potential of engaging with otherness in a way that actually opens up our imaginations of understanding how to actually cross over borders and move beyond the very simplistic binaries of Americans being all good or bad, Chinese as being all good or bad, or for that matter, Canadians being all good or bad, right? That tends to kind of be, in the US context, oh, Canadians, we have a certain, thought, the Canadians are where humorists and comedians come from, and we tend not to think of Canadians as being part of that binary, but in fact, I think the construction of all cultures tend to be as a binary of who the other is, oftentimes in a dangerous, infringing binary. So I've spent a lot of time doing work on Chinatowns, trying to reconstruct the history of Chinatowns and why they emerged. A lot of what I ended up with is thinking that it's not like Chinatowns emerged because Chinese are clannish, but there's a historical context for that. And the historical context really has to engage with how the world becomes globalized at an earlier point, especially linked to colonialism and to the China trade itself. And the China trade goes global, but New York, in the history of the new nation, the new US nation, becomes the first major port that is venturing into China and actually developing the China trade and growing the wealth of New York, rebuilding the wealth of a city that had been devastated by the British and the Revolutionary War, and then becoming a global power. And that kind of pattern that emerges out of New York expands and extends to so many other parts of the world now. So I wanted to kind of emphasize that the question of the time of 1784, when the Empress of China leaves the port of New York and goes towards China to try to get to China at a point that it can begin to trade whatever goods it had to get things that gentlemen and gentlewomen, the founding fathers and mothers wanted on their dining tables, from porcelains. General George Washington wanted always the latest of porcelain sets, even in the height of the American Revolution. So how did that question of what did China want then drive so much of what we're facing today? So here I made the leap from looking at Asian American studies, Chinese American studies, Chinatowns, Yellow Peril, where I spent a lot of my time doing that work, Chinese exclusion, looking more and more at the intersectional nature of these phenomena, which includes eugenics, American eugenics. New York City was the center of eugenics. for a good part of the teens and 20s and 30s, going to the 30s in global dynamics. And we can talk about all these things, but kind of going over this all really quickly. But then how does that also lead to, how does that go further back in terms of the dispossession of indigenous people, the enslavement of Africans, and the ways in which massive extreme extractivism actually happened? Now, we tend to think of extractivism as something maybe that you all are thinking about in terms of Vancouver or British Columbia or the Pacific Northwest, as the United States tends to think of that, this larger region. But from my point of view as a historian, it really begins maybe with Henry Hudson, kind of discovering and beginning his trading post in 1609, or we can go back to Verrazano, Giuseppe Verrazano, who enters the isthmus that now bears the name of the Verrazano Bridge in 1524. We can keep on going back, but the patterns are very clear in terms of how what is indigenous scholars will say settler colonialism actually operated. And it's not simply the dispossession of indigenous people or the enslavement of Africans to work that land to maximize wealth and power and profit, but the extreme extractivism part is the area that I've really been struggling to work on because of the climate crisis that we're now in. So for us to understand how history then also is not simply about, is it industrialization and are not recycling enough plastic bottles, that's why we're in the mess we're in. But I think more importantly, it's important to understand how the way settler colonialism operated and how extractivism, massive extractivism, was linked to it. Because it's really an attitude about once you own a parcel of property in your private domain, it takes it away from the commons in a sense that we all have to share the water, the soil, the crops that are growing on the soil, the berries that are growing on bushes freely. We have to begin to privatize that, and once you own that parcel, you can extract it to your heart's delight, because that land is yours, and you don't have to worry or think about the quality of the air, the quality of the water, and the quality of the soil. So that kind of thinking, which is deeply entrenched in a kind of colonial attitude that also impacts the way the British then basically colonized Ireland, for example, by massively extracting the oak trees in Ireland that really enabled the British to defeat the Irish. How can we understand those patterns as they entered into the United States or into the colonies, and how did the United States, once it had its revolution, continue that tradition in a way that is really why we're in the mess that we're in right now? So let me just show you really 4 quick slides that will kind of look at this pattern, and it's really about how contemporary culture is still unresolved about how to handle its relationship to nature, but its relationship to nature is also indicative of a lot of yellow peril kind of fears. And this is just one slice, making some quick connections to how settler colonialism also impacts and also has constituted yellow perilism itself. So I don't know how many of you actually seen this film, Annihilation. Natalie Portman, as you can see in the center, is one of the lead stars, but it really shows a group of 4 or 5 women who enter into this weird zone. How many of you have seen this film? I'm just curious if any. Okay, a few of you. It wasn't a big film, but I think it's actually an important film, and some people would maybe describe it as a horror film, and I think it is. It's actually a very powerful film, so I encourage you to kind of look on Netflix and see if you can find it. But they enter into this weird zone in which there's a shimmering effect on a parcel of land. And before you know it, they're finding, as this group of women, multiracial, entering into this zone, they start seeing nature as shimmering and transforming. So there are giant crocodiles, for example, and the plants are growing into human forms. It's really kind of uncanny. and fascinating because they're feminist heroines, multicultural feminist heroines going into nature and encountering this danger that they are now in charge of protecting and kind of winning victory over, or at the risk of the entire region and the entire civilization, modernity itself being threatened in terms of any possible future redemption. And part of it, this is kind of a blurry image, but part of it is that you start seeing this morphing of nature, in which on the one hand, there's a super disintegration. So this weird kind of deer-like, gazelle-like creature on the left, they're twins, but the one on the left is degenerating and dying, and the one on the right is like healthy and flourishing. So there's a doubling so much of the way nature is operating. And in fact, nature is exploding, but at the same time it's morphing, and its prior forms that we tend to take for granted are kind of disappearing. So it's like nature on steroids, and in some ways it reinforces the kind of Puritan fear of the forest, of the nature itself. We can talk more about this, it's a deeper pattern, but I just want to kind of present this and how it also resonates very deeply with an older pattern of how fear and anxiety was expressed. These images are probably well known if you know anything about Asian American or Chinese American history. These are kind of out of WASP, the WASP publication, which was a weekly coming out of San Francisco during the height of the anti-Chinese movement. And here you see railroad monopolies with Crocker, Charles Crocker, and Stanford, of Stanford University fame, in the eyes of this octopus. And the octopus, of course, is kind of controlling and overwhelming the ways in which really white labor, but also some Chinese labor, were sustaining themselves. So the miner is being overwhelmed. So you see, and they're dying in the graveyard. So a certain way of life that hadn't established itself too long is now being taken over by the railroad monopoly. Okay, so this is a very powerful kind of notion of a new technology coming in and overwhelming the way life had been. So there's a dramatic sense of loss, and there's a deep pattern of these kinds of political cartoons. So what's the emotional resonance when you actually get this newspaper and you look at a political image like this? It's not simply an analytical kind of reaction, but the successful political cartoon, the visual cartoon, or once silent films and moving pictures and talking films start taking an effect, or record players, there's an emotional, visceral impact that it has. So we enter into the realm of how culture operates, not simply intellectual, not simply rational, but how culture actually operates on our bodies themselves, our feelings. And how does that move us to feel certain kinds of ways or to tilt us in a certain kind of direction? So this kind of fear of loss is really quite powerful. It's comparable to something maybe that we would think about today in terms of how many white middle-class people feel totally threatened by the changes that are happening in terms of immigration policies, in terms of feelings of, Black lives matter, does that mean white lives don't matter? So all of these questions of how a traditional kind of way in which white nationalism and white culture has operated, and those assumptions are being dramatically eroded by demographics, by the way China has become so powerful so quickly. Those changes are deeply threatening, but also evoke a feeling of loss and threat. And how do they operate? And then you see here the Chinese octopus, right? So you see a very effective and easy way in which the emotions of fear and loss can get transferred to a personified group. So in the same way that perhaps Natalie Portman is kind of representing the threat that the shimmering nature on steroids is impacting all women, and therefore through women, all civilization, kind of civilization that they're trying to protect. You have the same issue here, where the Chinaman is the octopus who's taking over all these occupations and doing all these things. And they're forcing these poor white boys out of work, and they're being sent off by the policemen to the reformatory and the industrial reformatory in the background. Now, it's not a good history because you know that industries begin to kind of usurp and take over, all industries. But oftentimes in other political cartoons, you can see that the Chinaman actually becomes the machine itself. And in some ways, there's a lot of resonance today about AI, surveillance, kind of the way in which the Oriental has become the master of chips and automation, and how, therefore, that's so dangerous to have China or even Taiwan or Japan with the anti-Japanese feelings that those of us old enough to remember that kind of phenomena cannot have control. It cannot be in their control. There's always a switch from what the good Asian would be versus the bad Asian, and the bad Asian can switch very quickly, as we're witnessing now. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize really this question of how loss is really, in many ways, wired into modernity itself. Modernity is something that different people have talked about, the acids of modernity, in which what appears to be modern and the most cutting edge is constantly melting and constantly becoming ethereal, and therefore a new form is taking over. We're living in such a moment now, and the anxieties and the sense of loss and the fear that is left in that process then opens itself up to either moments of transformation and liberation to try to kind of resolve some of these issues, to try to think ahead, or actually to revert to the patterns of xenophobia, scapegoatism, kind of taking it out on the Chinese octopus, when in fact there are larger forces at play as well. So let me just end here, because this is just meant to kind of play with these questions of how change and place operate. And this is where Bakhtin's idea of chronotope is actually useful, but there'll be other questions that I think will come up in the discussion that might be also helpful as a way for us to understand and work through these questions, so then we're not simply reacting without understanding how the structures of feelings actually operate in these cycles. So thank you very much.
Panelists to come up. Maybe I can be at the end. Okay, so I've prepared a round of questions, and no need to answer in a line. Feel free to answer as you wish. So I think beginning with data as a starting point, I think just thinking about data research as how it affects or contextualizes our discussion on historical narratives and preserved memories. At what extent do we depend on the saying that data does not lie, or does it? Is there an element of manipulation that is problematic in the research use of data, or is it always still useful as a basis of origin in research?
Well, I think that that's a really important question about, does data lie? And I think my immediate response, and it was like getting this question, I was like, my immediate response was, it's not that data lies, data just doesn't tell you the whole truth. And that as by really understanding that data is a truth, it is not the truth, but then the power of data isn't when it's there by itself, but then in combination towards stories, the narrative, the feelings, that you move from the idea of fear to resolve. And I think that this is really, I think, part of the limitation. Funny enough, as a person who does teach data in his classes, I also talk about the limitations of that, because what we do know is that if data truly mattered in life, we wouldn't have climate change, no one would smoke, and my cholesterol level would be 20 points down. But that only 2 out of those 3 things need to change to save the world, and I'll let you choose what those 2 things are. But that it's very much to understand that data needs context. Data is discourse. Data isn't the end. Data isn't the end where you drop the mic and then walk out the room, but it needs to begin the conversation. And I think that by understanding and connecting the pieces of data to context, its strengths and its limitations, that you really see data in its full power. Because I think the other side, the technocratic dependence on data just being data, really fails the idea that we're human beings. And that by failing the fact that we're human beings, I think in so many issues that we just say, oh, it's just in the data, that you miss the possibilities of action, the ideas of empowerment, and really actually making things change.
In university, I started off in science. I was in physics. And so I learned a little bit about the scientific method, although that's actually for especially other applications. And the scientific method, you test out theories, right? You postulate something, and you look for the data to support your theory. And that's really great when you're trying to figure out a drug that will solve a migraine, but then you figure out, oh, it becomes Botox later. But the thing with data is it's so malleable, and it depends on how you find it and what you're looking for, and then what you do with it. As an artist, information, data, it's there to be researched, and for what end? From my perspective, it's to interpret. And I'm looking for an alternative to the dominant perspective of something. I'm looking for the obverse or the underside of things. In physics, you always look for the missing factor. You try to find all this information around something, and you figure out what's in the black box. That was the big metaphor back then when I was a kid. So as an artist, I'm also kind of looking for the black box for a situation and an approach to a condition that I find fascinating. And I don't want to just regurgitate it, but there's something intriguing in this condition. And you got to figure out what your stake in it is. But the information, what do you do with it when you, also when do you know you have enough information to make a statement about it? And the statement might not be so much of a declaration, but for me, it's more interesting when the statement is a new question or an alternative that you can pose for someone else to also continue asking. So in that way, you use this information to ask the question, what other information is missing to make a more fulfilling picture?
I think many of us are old enough to remember how Chinese medicine, acupuncture practices, and also notions of qi, of energy, right, was considered kind of superstitious and mystical. And in fact, American kind of policy was to say, no, this is just superstition, it's quackery. But things like qi is something, is still not understood. It's not really, and in some ways, I think as a person who's brought up in a Chinese cultural context, and maybe having seen the impacts of qi as an energy field and how it can be transmitted across different bodies, if one is a martial arts practitioner, for example, he begins to feel the impact of qi when a room full of people are kind of doing something together. And so there are areas that we still, in a Western kind of measurement-oriented frameworks still don't quite acknowledge and understand, but may be understood within other cultural contexts. And we can just talk about many different cultures this way and frameworks of knowledge. So I guess that's really important to kind of maybe offer as an example of the limits of any one system to understand, and how that oftentimes, that those limits can oftentimes be weaponized in a colonial context. The other quick comment I'll make, which is a recommendation, there's really a brilliant historian, anthropologist who recently passed away by the name of Michelle Rolfe Trujillo, who is really looking, the book that I'm thinking of is called The Silencing of the Past, Power and the Production of History. And in that volume, you can basically kind of boil down the key point is that facts or data exist. They can exist and be used separately, but they generally exist within the context of an assembly of other data. So the census records are actually a good example of that. Any one census, kind of year in which things were taken, in which the definition of who counts as Oriental, Black, White is constantly morphing. But if there's consistency or even inconsistency within that data set, it is a data set. And it becomes an authoritative data set. So there's an assembly of these bits and pieces that are gathered from door-to-door surveys, and they become an archive. So there's facts, an archive, and then there are stories. So what are the stories that are told of that 10-year data collection? And there's stories that are used in policy. There are stories saying that, oh, there are way too many Chinese, they're dangerous, these are the dangerous things that they're doing. Whatever the story may be, there's a story that begins to emerge that also oftentimes affects policy. And then the other fourth element is really then there's a history, which oftentimes means that the historian will marshal the facts, the archive, the stories, and that becomes really the capital H history. But there's also questions of how counter histories can begin to happen. And in fact, there are many cultures and many race cultures that have their own kind of facts, data, stories, and their own histories, but those histories are generally, they don't have enough PhDs, right? There aren't people who get that PhD and then write that book in the official academic press that's acceptable, or the official journal that's acceptable, to have a greater valence to begin to compete with the other kinds of more official narratives that are out there. So I guess I would, just say more or less the same thing, but there's a way to understand how these things operate systemically. But I think it's, in general, the artist and the poet who oftentimes are the ones who begin to question out of the box the logic and weigh the significance of how these heavily normative systems of storytelling operate and begin to kind of open them up.
Second question is about another kind of universal entrance into what we're all talking about, which is food. So Henry's book, and you talked about it a little bit, centers upon the historical memory and use of food as a gateway to the past. Maybe can we talk a little bit about food in all of your own research, or perhaps memories, relationships that trigger this inspiration? Maybe we can give some food examples, because some of us haven't had dinner and it's kind of nice to talk about food when we're hungry.
Well, I mean, as a new professor at SFU, I couldn't believe I actually got my food in the city class just passed by the academic senate. And it goes under the basic idea that behind every dish there's a story. And that behind every dish, that by understanding food, it actually gives you an insight into a city. It gives you insight into a community. It gives you insight into a neighborhood. And that it is one of the perhaps very few kind of universal interfaces through which we have the ability to connect. And I feel like that is, I think, why food in one way has kind of emerged into, I think, a topic that really can come join and connect people. I think that it's also one that is challenged because of, I think, really the really the ongoing crisis in terms of the cost of living right now, that there is, I think, food security issues, food security concerns, and yet at the same time, it is also, I think, the ability to kind of connect communities together, to pull them together in towards collective action.
It's interesting, Henry, in your talk, like what you do with explaining in the context of White Riot. What would you do if you were a white person before going out to riot? What would you eat? If you were a Chinese person, what would you eat? And somehow it's like putting people into different perspectives historically through the lens of food that I think is just really kind of an interesting way to do it. It really struck me.
Yeah, thanks. I'd just like to say that it would have been historically inaccurate for the white rioters to eat roast beef before the riot because it was a Saturday night, not Sunday.
Only a Sunday for
Yeah.
lunch. Yeah.
But the food, the decisions for those types of food, based on conversations that I had, the research was basically asking people. I looked for old people from different cultures. It was easier to find menus from banquets, and they'd be in English, so they'd be primarily French influenced, and exotic game and that kind of stuff. But I couldn't find any paper documents of what the Chinese were eating, or the Japanese around 1907, or Punjabi, or indigenous. But okay, so the decisions were basically made along lines of class. So who had more money? Who had more power? Who had access to more expensive ingredients? For the Chinese, they were generally really poor. And congee is a way to spread out what little rice you have. People in poor areas will eat congee. But it was spiced up a little bit with some pork, which is very Chinese. And then the chef decided to throw in corn, which would not have been common at all. Corn was to be fed to the pigs, right? Although different from the kind of corn we get nowadays, is really sweet. The other really poor kind of demographic was South Asian, especially the mill workers, who were tending to eat, like most people would eat more or less the same thing every day, except they might have a special day on the weekend, on their one day off, and that was dal. Lentils and naan or chapati. The Japanese were better off. There was more opportunities for them. They were supported by Japan, rising nation politically, economically, and just before. Okay, this is jumping later. Just before internment, 1942. There were, I think, over 40 sweets shops around the Powell Street area. That's a lot. And whoever got to eat candy when they're a kid growing up poor, you get it once or twice a year and that'd be it, right? But there was enough wealth within the Japanese Canadian community to support desserts. That was amazing.
Yeah.
For the whites, it was roast beef, which back then would have been expensive. It's more expensive now, relatively speaking. Yorkshire pudding and horseradish, which would have been, you'd splurge for that for a nice Sunday meal if you could afford it. For the indigenous folks, it was salmon, and they'd be depending on salmon. It didn't really change that much, the chef kind of spruced that up too, and put in pickled spruce tips. And spruce tips would not have been fancy like they are now, which are used by mixologists for $18 cocktails. But back then, you just pull them off the trees in May, right, when they first come out, and you just have them as little light snacks. So I thought about reflecting the sort of like general class divisions through the food as well.
Yeah, it's really great. Jack, did you have?
More anecdotes, but I've also taught a course on global noodles, and when I was at NYU, you could just hop on a subway and get to any borough in the city, so that my students, which are kind of half Asian and half not Asian, were grappling with really the norms that they grew up with, and therefore how noodles and you know, unleavened bread could be a vehicle to kind of encounter the historical context and differences with maybe the norms that being Cantonese or being Jewish or being Italian might have emerged, you know, and how did their notions of what was normal for being an Italian wasn't even normal for being an Italian, you know, in terms of the practices. But I'll just kind of tell an anecdote to reinforce what Andy was saying in terms of the potential of food to bring people together, but also the potential of food to kind of notice norms and the limits of norms and cultural differences. So I have my partner is not Asian, she's not Chinese, and one of the early times that we got together with a meal with her mother, who loves seafood, we ordered a whole Chinese flounder. And some of you may have experienced this, but so she was really happy and delighted to see this whole fish. And so she starts as the elder to, you know, going around the Lazy Susan, and she basically cuts, I would say, a third to a half of the whole flounder and puts it on her plate, right? And, you know, those of you who are giggling would know that, oh my God, this is like so rude, right? I mean, this is like you know, how could one person take all that and put it on their own plate? But in some ways it betrays the difference between, let's say, having porridge or dal and sharing that, right? And if you don't have enough, you add more water or you add, you know, a little bit more so that everybody gets to share it, which is a very social way of eating versus having individual portions in which that whole piece of meat is yours and nobody should touch it, and the vegetables is yours and nobody should touch that, and the other, you know, carbohydrate is yours. So the ways in which cultures and old world cultures were linked, but then how they modernize, right? And then the difference of how people think of themselves as individuals with their own individual portions that they have possession of, it's theirs, right? Versus sharing it, and if you only have so much, you only have so much, right? You share the limits of that. Or within a hierarchy, within a patriarchal family, you know, the father gets the first round and gets more, and the kids have to ask permission to get seconds, you know. So all of those dynamics are really interesting in how they indicate something about the culture and the politics and the hierarchies that exist.
Would have loved to take your global noodles course.
What's that?
Would have loved to take your global noodles course, too.
Yeah. Well, you know, it happened, I mean, it can happen here because I think you have enough.
I'm taking notes.
But I mean, you need a diverse enough, you know, so you can then have students go to basically retrace the Silk Road in which noodles go across, tell the history of, by having them go to certain kinds of restaurants that are in the far out reaches of Sheepshead Bay, for example, in which they can get kind of Central Asian foods, right? Central Asian noodles, and see how dumplings, for example, transform in that process. So it's tough to do it in Newark. We can't do it where I am now, but you can probably do it here. But you need a subway to get around easily and to kind of go to the far reaches in which you get that one mom and pop store that can do that kind of noodle that isn't part of the normal, you know, kind of wonton, you know, chop suey type menu, right? So
interesting. I think I'm going to open it up to the audience because we're kind of running a little bit late. Questions from the audience? May need some help. One in the back to the right.
Hi, thank you. I'm Crystal. I'm a journalist, and I write on, I guess, like Chinese diaspora in North America. I guess my question is for Jack. Thank you for talking about making the, I guess, drawing the comparisons between Annihilation, the movie, but also like the kind of the historical propaganda earlier. I'm wondering about like the Chinaman kind of octopus, Chinese becomes the machine kind of thing. I guess I'm wondering how you might, whether you could speak on how that resonates still today. I know that you talked about it in terms of the context of like chip makers and like China tech, but could you speak on it a bit further in terms of maybe the rise of TikTok, Shein, kind of the controversy around that as well?
Yeah, did everybody get to hear that question? Yeah? Okay. There are Asian American scholars who are starting to write what is called about techno-Orientalism, so I would encourage people to kind of look at that. But even early on in some of the early pulp fiction that existed, between World War I and World War II, there's already this kind of prefiguring of the Oriental in that sci-fi as being not having emotions, and that was preceded in the 19th century by really how some of the anti-Asian laws were played out. There were medical theories, for example, that Chinese were able to labor as long as hard as they would in the U.S. context, and therefore it was unfair competition to the white workers because their nerve endings were further away from the surface of the skin. Right? So you get these kinds of logics that are supposedly describing the different laboring conditions or different orientations that people had. There wasn't a sense that these Chinese are fully human, and therefore, but there are different things driving them, or different things they felt responsible for, or different social relationships they had. So those kinds of contexts and human kinds of ways of understanding cultural differences and cultural similarities tended to kind of morph into biological differences, or somehow their wiring with Pulp Fiction, their wiring was different. They were kind of like human machines who didn't have emotions. When you first started getting a lot of the young Asian musicians starting to make it in American culture, in U.S. culture, I'm sorry to say American culture, but U.S. culture, for example, because that's what I know, and you'd start seeing them playing in New York City at major venues, whether they're Korean Americans or whatever, these prodigies. Some of the early critics were saying, well, they played technically extremely well, but they had no emotion in their ability. Now, there may be some truth to that, it's hard to say, but there's a pattern there in terms of kind of representing the Oriental other as being really more mechanical, very good with dexterity, making chips. There's also the argument that Asian women were perfect for making computer chips because they had such delicate hands and they had that, And so these kinds of arguments are oftentimes made in direct connection, and sometimes they're offered as in all forms of Orientalism, not simply as a negative thing, but somehow it's meant to be a compliment. Somehow they're capable, they're wired for that, and they can do things that white people can't do. So it's a more complicated dynamic than simply saying, oh, they're evil. But it's also a feeling of threat and a feeling of unfair competition and a feeling that somehow they're going to surpass us and we don't have a chance. So it's kind of like the white men can't jump, kind of phenomena with other groups, so there are these dynamics that are embedded, I think, so much in the culture that they're very intersectional, and they kind of always speak to whether the white man can maintain the position or are they constantly threatened. And we've seen that happen over different times. It's not just now, but after the Civil War, when Reconstruction was passed, there's a great fear that blacks being elected, having the right to vote and being elected, were going to overwhelm. So W.D. Griffith, did Birth of a Nation with that kind of fear and peril in mind and the sense of loss of what was going to happen to the white superiority, which is why the KKK really emerged at that time in a different way. So yeah, I hope that addresses it.
But building on this, really, I think an interesting question here about race and memory and technology, I think a really interesting one, and this is one I would put to Melissa, because I think that this is an interesting question I have to you, and I know the Minister of responsible, I think, for culture is here, that really, I think one of the interesting things I think has happened in terms of the BC Museum, the kind of dynamics that have happened in what we remember, how we remember it. And I think for me, as a teenager going to the BC Museum, as everybody who goes to high school in Vancouver goes to the great field trip to the BC Museum, that I think one of the powerful and artifacts that's actually in the BC Museum is, well, what's called the Iron Chink. And that is a machine that was taken from one of the, I guess it must have been a fishery.
I think it's the
plant.
Fisheries Museum.
Yeah, Fisheries
right?
Museum.
Yeah,
yeah,
it's still there.
It's
in
still
Richmond.
there. And then, what do you do? Like, how do you inhabit that physicality of a machine, and yet the kind of inane racism that occurred there? And do you hold it up? Do you put it into the holdings, into the basement of a museum? What do you do in those instances? Because in one way, one can perhaps move it and put it down. You kind of already see my bias is that, or do you put it forward and you talk about this, and yet at the same time, where it lies, where we are today, and how would you deal with the Iron Chink?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting you ask or use that example, because the museum in Richmond that houses that, it's become more and more of a complex problem because of the demographics of Richmond. Richmond in Vancouver is predominantly Chinese. And
Literally 50% Chinese.
50 only? Really?
Straight on Chinese, and then the sizable Japanese community, and the sizable, but I mean it's almost 75% Asian.
So actually the museum reached out to us, the Chinese Canadian Museum, and asked us this specific issue and asked us to assist them on how to address this issue for school groups, for tours. And in a way, if we didn't exist, the Chinese Canadian Museum, there was a sense like, who would they ask? Everything is kind of hyper, politicized. And for them to understand who to ask or where to ask, it's complicated. And they are a museum that's predominantly non-Chinese. So it was helpful that we existed in the context of being able to create this situation where we could advise them. Not that we are in any way experts on how to deal with these systemic racist histories or how to contextualize, but at least we can help, right? And so I think that in the end is something that we exist to do and to also evolve and help in the community.
I'll just say a quick anecdote. So I was working on a core exhibit for the Museum of Chinese in America, and I went online. I was curious, and I found a piece of a Northwest Iron Chink machine, kind of machine. So I was able to order it online, and
that's a heck of an eBay kind of request there.
And it was really because people were so embarrassed they didn't know what to do with it, so they disassembled it, and I was able to buy a part of it, right? But that's typical of a lot of what's going on, in which there's so much racist so-called memorabilia, but really aspects of the past and the industrial past, and how so many figures and kinds of racial imagery were really part of the commodity marketplace, that people don't know what to do with this, and and this includes monuments as well, right? What do you do with it? And most people would tend to think, well, we just have to get rid of it and hide it. But then how do you actually reckon and grapple with it? Maybe you need to put it somewhere else, but how do you reckon and grapple with these questions? Yeah.
Another question from the audience?
Yeah, I just had a quick question, maybe to start with Andy or anyone who wants to jump in, but this question of how we capture data today, what are the blind spots that you see, someone from the future looking back at us now, what is it that we're missing? Someone who's dealing with data sets, capturing these places, what can you maybe read into the present?
I love this question because it was the third question I didn't ask. So luckily, Am asked it.
Well, I mean, my immediate response is, as with many of my responses, begins in 90s hip hop, right? And it's the idea that you check yourself before you wreck yourself. And that really within this idea, and I think that this is the positive elements of how we changed, that we look at the ideas that, history may not repeat itself, but it perhaps rhymes, but yet at the same time, you have the possibilities of change, of reform. And I think that with what's happening, I think particularly in the provincial environment in terms of what's going on with addressing systemic racism, as well as dealing with how StatsCan now has active outreaches to measurements to ensure that there is a representation of groups, that there is, I think, this deeper interrogation of data categories and how data is collected. I think that we're not perfect. We are still missing some sizable challenges towards socioeconomic data, health data, but yet I think we are slowly moving together. And that part of this is, it isn't the idea that data is destiny, but that data is dialogue, and that dialogue does not end. It is one that you consistently go back and forth to make sure that you have a transparency and accountability to your data and your data collection, through which gets you closer to a truth.
I'm curious about one of the slides you put up earlier, which is the province of British Columbia with some of the letters missing. I got one of those letters in the mail. I don't know who might have gotten one of those, but I think I was included in a list.
I think it was a randomized survey instrument by StatsCan. BC Stats. And it's a particular initiative by BC Stats in order to, I think, work on a sizable initiative trying to fill in gaps for
but
data.
Doesn't it come out of a specific anti-racist initiative?
Yeah, in part. Also
part. Is it actually like randomized across the entire province, or is it certain people they figure are informed enough to have some kind of opinion as opposed to reaction, perhaps, or misinformed perspective?
Oh, no. BC Stats would have randomized.
This is completely randomized?
It's intended to be randomized.
Oh, yeah?
Otherwise, it wouldn't be a survey.
Okay,
It wouldn't be a survey.
because it's a little bit alarming thinking about a general kind of perspective on I guess sort of like representation, I suppose. So yeah, I haven't looked into it, but I'm so curious about it.
Well, actually, it's funny. This is how Jack is part of my origin story. That as Jack is part of my origin story, the prequel, if you will, that it's actually, when I was in New York, I was working for the Census Information Center for the Asian American Federation, and it was specifically created to ensure that various communities across the U.S. would feel empowered, feel a sense of participation in the census. That the idea is the census is for the commons, that it has helped to inform the distribution of the commons, the development of the commons, and that is again, one step. It's of a very long journey through which data plays a part of understanding the community, the nation that you are.
Yeah, I think that sort of one of the challenges that I think we're all kind of like being asked to address when we fill out these forms around self-identification is what you choose, how you choose to identify yourself. And especially for a growing kind of a demographic of people who have more than one cultural, racial, ethnic identity, sometimes they just choose to use one of them. Or sometimes they'll choose more, but they might omit some, and plus there's the fact that a lot of us don't know, right? So what we're getting is just, in some ways, an opinion or a position about yourself for Big Brother or whatever it is, right? Or however you perceive who is gathering this information. So to go back to your
yeah.
point, to your question, Am, it's like, well, is this really data? And according to Jack, yeah, it's a data set. But what is that information? Is it actually
What's
real?
the question you're trying to answer? And that's basically what you're, like every data set, it's asking, well, what's the question you're trying to answer, as opposed to, here's the data, go for it. And I think that that's, of course, one of the biggest challenges in data work, because you don't begin with a data set, you begin with a question. And then you begin to interrogate that data set and then look at what it can answer and what it can't. And I think that that is, I think, part of the kind of ideas of data literacy, and that there is this terrible history of Big Brother, but then there's also this belief that data can inform decisions, that it can be another marker of truth in towards informing a decision.
And data can empower, hopefully, also.
Data can empower, but it can sure as heck harm. I mean, my supervisor at UCLA, he helped do the initial research of how the U.S. Census was used to incarcerate the Japanese American population. That they systematically broke Article 13, and which was the secrecy element of the census to incarcerate the Japanese American population. And I mean, the interesting question was, did it happen here in Canada? And I think that there is certainly this sinister element of data systems. But then, of course, in the era that we are entering, that this is something that is just going to erupt even further, because you think about the idea of data and surveillance, that even in the 1930s, that there's a part in the Thompson book that talks about the deep desire of white racists in British Columbia wanting to use the census as a surveillance system for all Chinese Canadians, that to ensure that you knew exactly how many were living where. In the 1930s, mind you, which isn't the era we live in now, with AI, with the internet, with all those elements of data, that it presents a sizable challenge towards not the society, what happened in the past, but what we are into the future.
So just to kind of also ask about your slideshow. So there's one thing was that bar graphic of showing Vancouver as having the greatest Asian population. And in some ways that just kind of emotionally may confirm for people who are xenophobic to say, well, and maybe this is said all the time, I don't know, in Vancouver, that Asians have taken over, or Chinese have taken over. That's one kind of observation that many people could make without necessarily understanding why. The other one is really about the heavy emphasis now that's being placed on part of the problem with China is the way they're using facial recognition and surveillance. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe just kind of respond a little bit to them, because I think there are certain kinds of strong stories that are now being told that reinforce, and I think it's part of this question as well.
Right, indeed, and how are those stories, how those stories are told, who gets to tell the stories, how are we informing those stories? And I think for me, it's having that bar graph is a means of just understanding how the society we've become, that it's a measure of really how much Metro Vancouver has changed, and in one way, the kind of opportunities, the kind of new formations that we have in a place like metropolitan Vancouver that we don't necessarily see in other places. And yet, at the same time, it, I think, opens, opportunities and ideas, and yet at this, but then also, I think, gives a sense of a certain accountability. So I think that it's I guess the simple answer is it's complicated. But yet, I think it's one of those elements to kind of have, it's almost like art in a way, that a person can, two people can look at a single piece of art and have two totally different impressions. And I go ask the artists on this panel, how do you navigate through that? Because now we're literally talking about the art of data and how you can have one data set, one bar chart, and have an audience as vast and diverse and incredibly educated, I have no doubt, here, and yet have an incredible spectrum of interpretations of impressions, and how you get those interpretations and impressions to a singular action, or if even that's possible.
That depends on who gets access to that information and what they want to do with it. It's going to reflect their values, right? So yeah, that's all I have to say.
So we want to continue all of this, but maybe we could continue it over canapes and wine and coffee and tea. We have a small reception for everyone who is welcome to talk more to the panelists on the second floor. You will have to go up to the third floor and then come down to the second floor to go to this wonderful reception. I'd like to thank all the speakers and thank Henry in particular for organizing this, and also thank Am for the introduction and also for the wonderful space. Thank you all, audience members, for coming and listening to us tonight too.
Well, thank you.